it and then send it to you if you want
Okay.
it.
Oh, no,
I
no,
think you got it there.
there we go. We're recording.
Sweet.
All right. Michael, how are you?
I'm doing really great. Thank you.
So,
How you
sorry, Michael, what was your last name again?
Oliver.
Okay. So Michael Oliver, you work for MAPS, correct?
Yes. MAPS Canada to be specific, but
Yeah.
they're pretty similar. Yeah.
So MAPS, what does MAPS stand for, just for our listeners?
Sure. So MAPS stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
Okay. So, and your goal is around using psychedelic drugs or psychedelic pharmacology to see if there's a connection between that and therapeutic methodology. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely. So their MAPS main goal is to fund psychedelic research into looking into exactly like you say, the therapeutic uses of psychedelics, including cannabis, but focusing MAPS itself focuses on MDMA.
Right. So did you say MAPS Canada is focusing on the usage of MDMA?
Yeah, actually, both MAPS and MAPS Canada have been focusing on the uses of MDMA since kind of they started. So MAPS started in 1986, and one of its main goals was the overarching goal is to help develop, like you say, these medical and legal and cultural contexts to help legalize psychedelics for their careful use in therapy. And then the specific outlet that MAPS has looked at for that has been MDMA. And MAPS Canada kind of formed later in 2011 as an organization to help support the efforts in MAPS USA, specifically the MDMA phase 2 study. So yeah, their focus has been on MDMA.
Okay. Now again, I'm not a pharmacological chemist or anything like that, but MDMA, is it considered an amphetamine?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. MDMA is considered an amphetamine for sure.
Right. Now, what characterizes an amphetamine?
An amphetamine, well, it's different than it's a drug that, basically the common descriptions of it are a drug that alters your mood and perception,
right,
including your awareness of the surrounding objects, and also conditions, whether it being conditions, the appearance of conditions outside of yourself, like the environment, but also the conditions going on within inside yourself. So it's chemically similar to hallucinogens, because they also produce feelings of increased energy, pleasure, emotional warmth, these sort of things, and also distortion of time. But yeah, and methamphetamine is different than the classical psychedelics, for example, like LSD or psilocybin, because it doesn't act on the serotonin receptors.
Yes, because when I heard about MAPS and particularly the psychedelic aspect of it, I was thinking psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, DMT, things like that. And so when I hear MDMA, I'm like, my mind almost goes more into okay, well, that's a party drug. So to stereotype the usage of these drugs, right? So what made you guys think that, okay, hold on, maybe we can use this in a therapeutic setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, to be honest, I'd be curious myself to know more about the exact origins of where MDMA first came on the map for MAPS.
Yeah.
And Rick Doblin, I know. So Rick Doblin's who founded MAPS. And I think what I can say is that at some point along the line, I think whether it was a personal experience that Rick was having himself or he was noticing in other people, people would have been using MDMA recreationally, and oftentimes with psychedelic use, the lines between therapeutic use and recreational use are kind of blurred. So you might take a drug for a recreational experience, but then you find some of its therapeutic effects. And so somewhere along the line, they realized that MDMA actually is really useful, could be really useful for treating PTSD. And that was, as a result of looking at the current treatments for PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. They're looking at the current treatments for that, and there are some good treatments out there, but they're not close to being great treatments, and so there's lots of room to improve there. And they somewhere along the line realized that MDMA actually can really benefit people with PTSD.
Well, so classically, I think about drugs and particularly the quote unquote war on drugs,
Mm.
and how that's caused, more problems than it has solutions. Has there, like, in terms of using these drugs, how has the clashing of the war on drugs with your progress been? Has there been a lot of backlash?
Well, so I would say the main thing is that the government, there was a lot of research going into these substances a long time ago, right before the war on drugs started. So back
Right.
in the 50s and 60s is when kind of research started to blossom in these areas. And a lot of people might not know that there's actually really rich historical threads of research in investigating all sorts of things, including MDMA, but also looking into mescaline, psilocybin, and even LSD when after it was synthesized. And so after the war on drugs started, it basically just made it really difficult for these substances to be approved and like in a legal way. Obviously, there just became so many new hurdles that would have to be overcome. So it's not impossible. And MAPS has been showing that through careful and deliberate research, through these different, like when you need to bring any drug to market, you have to take it through a series of trials.
Right.
And that's what these phases are: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And so it just basically, the war on drugs just forced MAPS and Rick and anyone who basically wanted to do any serious research on these drugs, it forced them to narrow down their options into this one kind of stream, this one stream path of taking things from to market through this phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and which costs a lot of money. So basically, the war on drugs just introduced all these really big walls where it's like
Right.
you could have, yeah, it could have been easy. There could have been easier other ways to look into these drugs, but it just made it more difficult and more expensive.
So as somebody who, not disclosing, all of where I've gone, but I used to drink quite a bit, right? Like that was my party drug. And I look at people, I hear of these stories of people who have done MDMA, marijuana, for example, all these different drugs. And it's like, okay, they're not getting violent on that stuff. Whereas alcohol is the antithesis of therapeutic drugs, right? Like it's almost like, to me, weed opens your mind up, right? It's like an opening drug, and alcohol like closes you down and makes you myopic, right?
Totally. Yeah.
I don't know what your take is on that.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you. And I think it's really interesting and startling to just see there's a classic graph that's gone around, and it just plots, and it's useful to contextualize alcohol in this graph because it just plots, and maybe you'd be able to show it to your listeners here. They basically plot all the different drugs that we have available to us or illegal and not available to us, and they just plot the harm that it causes to the individual and the harm that it causes to others. And you can see on this graph easily that alcohol, which is a legal and very accessible drug, it causes a lot of harm to individuals and it causes a lot of harm to others. Because you think about all the people that have unfortunately been victim to, I know one example just being car crashes of, when you have someone else that's a drunk driver, they put a lot of people at risk on the road. That's just one example of how alcohol affects, it really drastically harms other people. And so, yeah, it's just mind blowing because you have that drug, alcohol, which is literally poison that we drink, right? Like literally it poisons our body in a pleasurable way, you could say, to some people. And so we have that as a totally legal option, and yet it kills like millions of people a year. And whereas on the other spectrum of the graph, you have something like psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, or LSD. These substances they're non-toxic, and they cause very little harm to the user and very, very little harm to others. Yet they're classified as Schedule 1 substances, deeming them to have no medical benefit whatsoever.
Yeah.
Strange.
So like because what's very interesting about your work is that it takes into great consideration set and setting. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So set and setting are two terms that have really helped to, it's basically given a lot of perspective to researchers that are investigating the psychedelic space, and it's allowed them to basically formulate and give answers to why a lot of people have even bad experiences with psychedelics. And so set is kind of like your mindset going into into an experience. So everything like mentally that you're carrying with you into the experience. And this could include maybe conditions that you have already, like mental health conditions, or just even maybe personality traits, experiences that you've just recently been going through, like maybe you've just broken up with your girlfriend. These things are all kind of fall under that. And then setting is basically your actual physical environment. So if you look around, whereabouts are you taking the substance? Are you at a rave?
Right.
Are you at a music festival? Are you in your apartment? Are you in a living room space with a counselor that's there guiding you through the experience? There's all these kind of environmental factors that also contribute heavily. So set and setting is basically just like a nice rule of thumb that was kind of developed just to bring awareness to the fact that a lot of the time when people have really bad experiences on psychedelics, it can usually be attributed to a poor choice in one of these areas. And I've definitely noticed that personally when I just meet people who've had experiences like bad trips, for example. A lot of the time, I would say just personally, this isn't like exact, just roughly, I would say like 90 or 95% of the time when I hear about someone who's had a bad trip, you can usually trace it down to a poor choice that was made regarding set or setting.
Right. Well, who was it that talked about the rules for flight? And a lot of this bad trip is that people are like resisting what's going on and they're trying to fight what's going on. And because they're fighting it, that's what's causing this like total adverse reaction. Whereas it's like, it's almost like an invitation. Like you should just go to that. Right.
Totally. Yeah. Surrender. And like, I think it was Bill Richards who talked about the flight instructions, and he wrote a book called Sacred Knowledge. He focuses a lot on, he's a clinical psychologist, I believe, and focuses a lot on the mystical experience and psychedelics and the kind of their interaction, which is really interesting topic. But yeah, regarding the flight instructions, yeah, kind of what you're getting at there is like accepting and surrendering to the experience is a really big part of that. And so I think that would kind of maybe fall under mindset or set, just like your willingness to be able to go with the flow, as you could say, or just, yeah, be willing to accept what arises. And it definitely comes back to the point about bad trips, because a lot of the time, even you might be going into an experience. And again, this maybe is more just my personal experiences and what I've noticed. A lot of people, you might have the intention to go into a psychedelic as a recreational experience, but sometimes you just can't control the fact that a lot of stuff that's going to come up might not be so recreational. It might be very personal and actually make you quite uncomfortable. And if you're not equipped or prepared to deal with that, and you find yourself on top of that, you find yourself in a bad environment, let's say like at a crazy party with tons of people that maybe you don't know, then it just creates the downward spiral. And from there, it's very difficult to have a good trip. And it's a lot easier to have a bad trip, quote unquote.
Right. Well, and going back to this, and I was getting set and setting confused, but I like that the idea of, where these people, these volunteers, where are they at in terms of their set? So do you guys try to use a bunch of healthy normals, or are you looking for something specific in, say, MDMA research? I think you're talking about PTSD.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think with our research, like I mentioned, we are focusing on MDMA to treat PTSD, and that's been like the main focus and where most of the money that MAPS has raised has been kind of funneled into in these phase studies. So for that, we're not looking at healthy normals. We are looking at
Right.
people that have and PTSD, and usually it's people that actually have treatment resistant PTSD. So they've tried a bunch of other things and nothing has worked for them. And so this is almost like a last resort treatment. And that seems to be the case in other areas too. Like if you look at Johns Hopkins University, they're doing quite a bit of the work on psilocybin mushrooms and to treat depression, and I think anxiety too. And with them, it's also the same. Like they're looking at people with treatment resistant depression or people with treatment resistant like end of life anxiety. So it's people that have tried other things and they're looking for something else to help them, something maybe more transformative or just more potent. And so yeah, with MAPS, particularly with the PTSD research, we're looking at people with PTSD, and so they have all the common signs and symptoms of that mental illness.
So what is the end goal here? Because first of all, I think this is like truly wonderful work, and any way that I can help get it out there, that's what I certainly want to do.
Thanks.
What is the end goal for in terms of MDMA? Is it to make it like a controlled substance, or to make it available to the public? What's
yeah,
the goal?
I think there's maybe some different models, and depending on how things move through the next couple of years, there'll maybe be different avenues that open. But for the most part, MDMA is on track now to be a prescription medicine in 2021.
Wow.
So next year. Yeah. And so that's kind of the main idea. So the idea is that this would be not something that you can get over the counter, but it would be something that, if you go to your doctor, it could be an option for him to prescribe you to get MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And so that would be the specific on-label use, as they would say. But like with other medicines that have been brought to market, there's an on-label use, but there's also an off-label use. And so psychiatrists and psychologists who start to use this in their practice, they have the authority to, kind of, if someone comes into their office and they feel that they don't necessarily have the exact type of PTSD that MDMA is prescribed for, but they still think that MDMA would be able to help them, they can prescribe MDMA as like an off-label use. And so that kind of starts in the community of psychiatrists and psychologists that will kind of expand the uses of MDMA, and then hopefully over time it'll be recognized as a more applicable medicine to other things too. But yeah, that's kind of the track that MDMA is on right now.
So there's a very interesting history that maybe not all of us know about in terms of psychiatry, psychology, and drugs. And Sigmund Freud, he was a known proponent of cocaine.
Yeah.
And he even had a cocaine-related psychotic episode.
Right. Yeah, I think I heard about that.
Yeah, right. And I mean, of course, back in the late 19th century, cocaine was completely, available.
Yeah.
Right. But now, obviously, cocaine is purity, all these things. There's so many concerns around it. So how do you get like pure MDMA? Because obviously that's what's going to be prescribed.
Yeah. So exactly. So through all the studies that MAPS have been working on, one of the basic requirements is that the MDMA has to be like 100% pure. And so if people who maybe don't like know what that would even mean, when you talk about street drugs, for example, a lot of the time people talk about Molly, which is like almost another name for MDMA, but we should be clear that Molly a lot of the time just refers to the actual street form of it, which is often laced with other things, or it's just a combination of drugs. So it's usually the MDMA that you get, or I should say Molly that you get on the street, is usually never 100% MDMA, which is what people would want to go for. So what's made actually these the studies and the research that MAPS has done really, really expensive, like one contributing factor is the fact that they have to use 100% MDMA. And so this just needs to be chemically and synthetically derived in a laboratory. Sorry, one sec. My Zoom just said that I've been signed out for some reason, but you can still hear me, right?
Yeah, I see you, hear you. Yeah.
Okay, that's odd. All right, never mind. It just said I got signed out for some reason, but I'm still here, so never mind. But anyway, sorry, what I was just saying was that's kind of one of the main reasons why MDMA therapy has been so expensive, is because it has to be 100% pure. And what it takes to actually derive synthetically 100% pure MDMA, I'm not sure. I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm sure it's a lengthy and precise process.
Because here's what I'm looking as somebody who practices in the mental health field and is, completely fascinated by it. Pharmacology, traditional Western pharmacology it's just not really working. The cost benefit is just not there. Right.
Totally.
And that's why I think something like MDMA with the therapist there, like you could have some real breakthroughs for people. Of course, like you say, it's super expensive. Right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's the thing. I like to use the word I kind of alluded to earlier, but transformational. That seems to be a key theme of a lot of these psychedelic therapies, is that they really are transformational medicines, which is not what you're getting right now with almost, all of the current prescription medicines that you take. I took a psychopharmacology course last term in school, and I learned that every single treatment option right now, like the traditional Western treatments for depression, for example, require chronic administration. And I think this is a really important point, because, you think about all these medicines, they require people to take them every single day, not only for like a couple of days, but oftentimes for years for some people, right? They're taking this every single day. And then I think one of the most amazing things and what makes psychedelics transformational medicines is that it's one time.
Yeah.
Potentially, right? Maybe two, but like a lot of people are having these amazing responses and healing episodes just through one use of a substance like magic mushrooms or MDMA or LSD. So it completely, it's not even, it's in a whole other ballpark compared to these other medicines. Like it's really hard to, I think, for the Western system to accommodate something like that. It almost doesn't know what to do with it. And I think one reason for that is just the money incentive, right? A lot of people will say,
Right.
Big pharma is, it's an industry and it's an institution now that does, you could argue makes a lot of money off of people suffering. And
Yeah.
the very fact that people have to take these drugs for years is incentivizes profit, right? And so to have a drug that only like fixes and cures or at least greatly contributes to someone's healing in one dose, it doesn't match with that
Right.
that money making model.
So, not to be a conspiracy theorist or anything, but it's almost like they're afraid of that, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Because
Yeah,
that's money out of their pockets, right? They're
totally.
like, holy, they don't need me anymore. Have you ever heard of, correct me if I'm wrong, is it called adiatropic effects? It's
No,
when,
I haven't heard of that.
okay, well,
What is it?
I'm probably saying it wrong then, but by taking these antidepressant pills, you become depressed,
Mm.
right? Like it creates the
Oh, right.
mental
Okay.
illness.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like it creates the symptoms of the illness that you're trying to treat.
Yeah, like whatever was going on, be it PTSD, something traumatic happened when you're a child or whatever, but that's why that happened. It's not because you're depressed. Like there's meaning behind it, right?
Mm,
Like
totally.
one of my favorite philosophers, counselors is Viktor Frankl, who survived
Oh,
the
cool.
Holocaust. And he
Yeah,
talks about, we have to have meaning. And that's where these drugs kind of come in. It's like you have this effect and you're just like, whoa, I see it. And you hear these, uh, is it called phenomenology?
yeah. It's an annoying word to say, but yeah, phenomenological symptoms, or yeah,
Yeah.
you had it right. Phenomenology.
But you look at someone's experiences and it's like that's what you're getting. It's not a numbers thing. It's like a subjective, this person takes this drug and they get this reaction and this has helped them.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that you brought up Viktor Frankl. I just finished reading his book, A Man's Search for Meaning, like 2 weeks ago. It was
Great
my first
book.
introduction
Everybody
to
read that
his
book.
stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a great book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I like you bring him in his theory, because like you say, he's all about meaning, and that does relate back to strongly what we're talking about here, because at the core of a lot of these, I think it's about what's at the core of a lot of these symptoms. And apart from psychedelics being transformational in the sense that they require one dose as opposed to like 100 or 1,000
mm,
sustained chronic doses, the other reason that they're largely transformational is because they target the root of the issue. I think they're not targeting the symptoms. So a lot of these uh,
yeah.
pharmacological interventions that are being used today, they help some people and they cover some symptoms, but they also have terrible side effects, and they are only just covering the superficial layers of these of illnesses. Whereas psychedelics, and all of them to differing degrees, they really go in and they are somehow able to treat the root cause of the issue, which oftentimes comes down to some sort of trauma that
Mhm.
someone's experienced, and like you say, maybe some sort of lack of meaning, or like a distortion of meaning somewhere along the line.
Well, and here's the thing, going back to this chronic usage is we're keeping people sick,
Absolutely.
right? And
Yeah,
that to me, it's like,
it's sad.
it's disturbing,
Yeah, it's really disturbing.
right? How many people are suffering out there? So, you know, and now here's the other thing, because Canada and USA, they have very different drug and, controlling agencies, correct?
Yeah, they're slightly different. I think overall their structure is similar, but they're called different things, and they have slightly different processes. I think the DEA in the States does a lot of like controls a lot of what happens with the legalization efforts there, and then here we have in Canada, we have just a governing body called Health Canada that does a lot of the similar stuff here. Um, but yeah, they're pretty much the same.
And they're on board with this.
To an extent, I think it's slowly getting there now that more and more research is coming out. But for the they really have had no choice but to not be involved with it recently, or just up until recently, because of, the fact that they were made illegal. So they don't really have, it's the government in the States, it's the government at the high level that decides what substances are illegal or not legal, what class they're scheduled as. And so once all these psychedelics were moved into their schedule, then it became really difficult for any other body or agency to do anything to work with them, because they were just basically deemed completely toxic and they have no value for medical purposes.
Right. Which is so strangely ironic, because then you look at what's in Adderall and stuff like that, right? So are you familiar with Johann Hari, the author?
Yeah, he wrote Homo sapiens, right?
Am
I thinking of someone different?
You know what? Yeah, that's Yuval. They have very similar names, actually. Okay. Also a great book, Sapiens, wonderful book. But he wrote this book called Chasing the Scream, and it's talking about the war on drugs and how the war on drugs has created, like, it's like a weird self-sustaining thing. Like, by fighting drugs, like, I remember when I was in doing my undergrad, and we were learning about the U.S.-Mexican war on drugs, and there was Ronald Reagan and his wife, is it Nancy Reagan?
I think so, yeah.
And she started the war on drugs. And it was like, we need to stop bringing cocaine and crack into here. But it was like, okay, you're missing the point, because you're fighting the what, but not the why. Why are people taking drugs? Right?
Yeah, I feel like that was not considered at all when these things were rolled out, like, at all. It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, because if you're an addict, you're going to do the drugs no matter what. And Johann Hari, his argument is that you legalize drugs to a certain extent. So I don't know where you are with that, but what will that look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, like, determining what sort of post-prohibition models could exist is one of the main goals of MAPS, and specifically, it's one of the main goals of, in MAPS Canada, we have like a committee called the Drug Policy Committee, and that's one of the main goals of our Drug Policy Committee, is trying to figure out what sort of post-prohibition models will work, because we assume that at some point these things are going to be like unprohibited. They're going to move into a point and a place where they won't be illegal substances. But then it's like, even once, it's not like once we have that, then we're in the clear, because then you got to, like you say, you got to figure out, well, what sort of model are we going to have? And I know there's no one, I don't think anyone knows for sure what that's going to look like yet. It's still hard to say. I know something interesting. My boss, Mark Hayden, and also the founder and director of MAPS Canada, he coined kind of an interesting concept. I believe it was him, or he might have had inspiration from someone else too, but this idea of having like a psychedelic license. So just like you get a license for driving, you learn about it, you take a course, you have some experiential education around it and a test. You can imagine something kind of similar for psychedelics, where it just would allow people to take on the responsibility of using these substances by themselves. You could have different licenses for, like, you could have a license for a therapist, but maybe you could also just have a license for just someone, you just want to experiment with psychedelics yourself, and I think as long as people have the education, then you can responsibly use them. And it's funny because we have, it's just interesting to think about how that's going to come out, because obviously we talked about alcohol already. Like, that's a drug that is like, you can literally just kill yourself with it.
Yeah.
If you want. And so many others. Think about cigarettes, another drug that has caused so much harm to individuals and also society, that's available for people. And so, I don't know, I think we need to take whatever post-prohibition model we have, it's going to have to, I think, take into account a really good form of education, and maybe starting with, like, adolescents too, like informing people at a young age, like informing them of, like, a realistic understanding of substances, not based on kind of stigma and these lies that have basically been fed to us since the Reagan administration rolled out this war.
Well, an interesting thing is, people who are like, don't do drugs, they're the people who have never done them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So totally. It's like, well, you don't know what psilocybin mushrooms are like. You don't know how much fun they are. So, fuck off, right? But that's the other thing. It's like, with these, we do have to have a degree of education, because for sure 14-year-olds should not be tripping LSD. You know, high school might look very weird if that's the case, right? So it's like, what's a healthy age for the brain to start experimenting with psychedelic drugs?
That's a really good question, and I don't have a firm answer. I don't think we don't have enough research, I'd say, to clearly establish a specific age, but I could link you to an interview actually with Mark Hayden, who I just mentioned, the director of MAPS Canada, where he actually recently was talking with a gentleman on a YouTube channel called Psych Substance. They were actually talking about this very question, like at what age can you take psychedelics? And I was actually surprised. I hadn't talked to Mark about this before I saw the result of the interview. And, you know, the argument he made was just like, it does come down to education. I think in the interview he said, like, there's not really anything that says that a 14-year-old can't use a psychedelic. And I've actually heard of a lot of people, if you think of like Eastern cultures, like I've heard of individuals that started using ayahuasca when they were 13, just because it was integrated into their culture, right? And I think as long as it's integrated into the culture properly, which would come from with education, right? I assume a lot of these, you know, Shipibo or Brazilian, Peruvian cultures, let's just say that have individuals that are doing this in their culture, there's obviously going to be there is deep integration with these substances into their culture, and it's not something that isn't done with a lot of care and attention. And so I think if we have something similar it wouldn't be exactly the same, but something similar in the Western side of things, there's nothing really saying that. If it just depends. Mark's argument was essentially, it depends on how responsible and mature you are. Because, you know, age is, you could say, just a number. And people have different varying degrees of maturity, but then you also got to think the other side of the coin too, is that there is something to be said about your brain developing. Like, your brain isn't fully developed, you'd say, until I think you're like in your mid-20s, and depending on what gender you are. I think they've said that, you know, males, I believe, take longer for their brain to fully develop than females. Sorry, maybe it could be the other way around, but yeah.
Mine didn't develop till I was 30, so yeah. No, but you're right. The prefrontal cortex, which is the area of our executive functioning, you know, it's not developed until, you're right, we're in our, for males, our early 20s. I'm pretty sure. Again, you know, I am not you know, that's not my area of expertise.
Right, but it's something around that. It takes at least until your 20s until it's fully developed. And so yeah, you wouldn't want to stunt it in any way, or you want to make sure that growth is not interrupted by these substances. And there's just the honest truth is there isn't enough research, I'd say, right now to conclusively say anything about that.
Right. Now, a book that I just listened to, The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. Have you ever heard that one?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I haven't actually read it, which is a shame. I read his other book called The Island, which is a fiction book, but he's one of my, I've read a couple other of his like short stories, and he's an amazing writer, and I need to read that. Was it good?
Oh, well, as I said, I heard it as an audiobook.
Okay.
And the ending sticks out so well. And it's just this idea of, we just want to escape reality, because reality is just, you know, at least Western reality. And then he talks about all the other cultures. There's such a banality to it. Like, it's like, oh my God, is this it? And then we take certain substances and we escape, right? But going back to what I said about the difference between alcohol and psilocybin mushrooms, is alcohol, it just like, there's just a darkness to it all. I don't know, just based on my experiences. Whereas at psilocybin mushrooms, it's like I don't know, there's just, the world is a very different place, you know. And I don't know if you can speak to your own phenomenology with this, your own experiences.
Yeah, no, I definitely could a bit. Like, I definitely feel that the same way about alcohol. Like, I personally grew up drinking alcohol in like in a normal way, I'd say. You know, just in the sense that it was a drug that was kind of enshrined in the culture here, and it's something that just a lot of people do. My dad actually ran a bunch of pubs in England, so like that was his line of business, was running.
Oh, you're from England?
Yeah, I was born here, but my parents are from England, and I grew up in England for like 8 years. I lived there. I actually lived, when I was younger, I can't remember this, but this is when I was like between 1 and 8 years old, but I actually lived in pubs. Like, I lived upstairs above a pub because my dad would own the pub downstairs.
Right.
So I don't remember too much of that, but now my dad, it's kind of funny, he has like a bar, and he's turned his man cave in his house into like a bar. and that means a lot to him because a lot of his work was using alcohol. But I find it so interesting because he's traditionally, he's never smoked cannabis or would never smoke a cigarette. He's highly against like cannabis and cigarettes and psychedelics, and so he's accepting now of kind of what I'm doing because he understands that there's something to it, and obviously it's a field that's emerging now. But I just find it interesting because obviously it all comes down to kind of your cultural programming, and for me, alcohol was an easy part of that. And so but then when I experimented with psychedelics, like you say, they just completely, they're so potent, and there's just so many layers to it, and there's so much to learn. I feel like psychedelics can be used as tools. Like that was kind of my first introduction into using them. I didn't, my first experience with them, I would say, were recreational, but at the same time, like this was alluding to earlier, that the line between that and therapeutic uses is super blurred. And for me, it was a recreational experience, but at the same time, it was super cathartic and empowering, and just shed a bunch of layers for me to like start the investigation of myself. And that's kind of was my way into these experiences. And then it was only later that I started learning about stuff like what MAPS is doing and like how these drugs can actually be applied for mental illnesses.
So how old are you, Michael?
I'm 24.
Wow. Okay. And you're a super knowledgeable guy. What made you get into this? Because, here you are, you're working with Rick Dobbin, you're rubbing shoulders with some very influential people.
Yeah.
Right.
I feel super honored and grateful for that.
Yeah. Yeah. So what got you into this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was just experimentation. Like I think in high school, I started smoking cannabis towards the end of high school. At the time here, there was a bunch of, Vancouver is an interesting city, and it was at that time and still is, like with cannabis. Obviously now cannabis is legal in Canada, but when I was graduating high school, it wasn't yet, but it was a really weird gray area. And so me and my friends, we started experimenting with that. And I personally classify cannabis as a psychedelic. So I would say that cannabis was my first entrance into that. I can attest to the fact that, like, I think edible experiences with with cannabis can really feel like a psychedelic experience, and you can have some really crazy experiences with edibles and even smoking too. So I'd say that was kind of my first experience with that. And eventually, I don't actually smoke anymore or take cannabis anymore, but that was something that I used to do quite a bit because I found it I found it a better alternative to alcohol. Like alcohol, I always had the hangover.
Yeah.
There was never any aspect of learning or development. I just felt like I was
can't remember. Yeah.
Exactly. It's the opposite. Exactly. Yeah. You feel like shit and you can't remember any of it. So it's completely opposite. Whereas with cannabis, I feel like it added a new element to my experience and like allowed me to see things in a different way. It's, it's cliche and it's kind of hippie sounding, but it opened up my mind to these different realms of perception, I guess you could say. It opened new doors of perception, you could also say. Then there was, I think I met someone in my high school who had experimented with mushrooms before. And so that was my first experience with a traditional psychedelics, was with mushrooms. And in a similar way that cannabis kind of opened up a bunch of these doors, I saw that mushrooms did the same thing, but in a grander way. And I was just blown away by like the noetic quality of these substances, and also just how they connected me to a deeper sense of self. I think that was really what did it for me. And actually what really kind of got me more into it, because I was originally going to be studying kinesiology. I wanted to go into physio after high school, but I had a really crazy mystical experience through meditating. And it was kind of I started pairing meditation with psychedelics and just these states of mind together, and in combination with like reading more into it and learning about the people that have already done a lot of exploration in this area, including Aldous Huxley, but also Terence McKenna. He was a huge influence on me growing up, which I felt might have been in some ways kind of, I don't know what the right word is, kind of odd. I mean, he's a super, I don't know if you listen to too much Terence McKenna, but he has some really strange theories, but I think some of the stuff that he talks about is just right spot on. And he really influenced me to look into these things more and take them more seriously. And then flash forward a couple of years, I switched what I was studying. I switched to cognitive science, which I was really interested in because it related to artificial intelligence, but also there was some relation to psychedelics. And then here, I'm actually at my university right now where I went to UBC, and here I joined the UBC Psychedelic Society. And then after a year, I was the one that was leading it for the next 3 years. And so I'd say that kind of really got my foot in the door of the more like academic side of things. And that's when I started organizing events, having speakers come to university to like talk about these things, organizing social events where people could come and talk about their experiences. Because I started to notice that breaking down the stigma is really like one of the key things that we had to do. And this was like 4 years ago. Before, because even in 4 years, so much has changed in the last 4 years with psychedelics. It's obviously like now it's almost coming to the mainstream, I'd say, and like all these businesses are coming into it. There's so much money flowing into it from all these different areas now. And anyways, yeah, that's kind of how I got into it.
That's why, I mean, such a great point. I mean, you're talking about the legitimization of this movement, because obviously people like, oh my goodness, Steve Jobs, right? I'm pretty sure he talked about dropping acid, right? Because you have Steve Jobs and you have Bill Gates, right? And Bill Gates was just like straight, you know, wow. But then you had Steve Jobs, and it's like, this guy became Silicon Valley, right?
Yep.
So obviously there's a legitimization there, because had this effect, had this insight, and now it's like, okay, these guys aren't just a bunch of hippies, right? Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but
yeah, exactly.
But there's something more to this, and I just think that in our society, you know, and I apologize for the listeners for sounding like a broken record, but we look at ourselves on our phones and everything, and it's like there's just more to this. And that's why I applaud the work that you guys do, because you're trying to answer this existential question of what is really out there, and the way that we've gone about things is just not working out for us.
No, it really is not. It's really not.
Yeah. So, you know, first of all, you know, as someone who's a registered counselor, how could I get involved in this if this is something that, say, I wanted to use psychedelic drugs to help in my therapy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's another one where unfortunately we don't have like a super firm answer, because it depends on how things are going to evolve. And obviously with MAPS in particular, like we've talked about, MDMA has kind of been the main focus. And so that's going to have one specific application at first, which is going to be for PTSD. So if you're a counselor or therapist looking to doing work outside of that realm, which most people are, I think it's going to be slow to get there, but there are things that you can do in the meantime. Like we're actually about to publish a psychedelic manual. So this is a manual for psychedelic guides. And this is going to be available online for anyone to read. And it's literally a step-by-step guide on how to actually do psychedelic work and how to do psychedelic psychotherapy from the perspective of, you know, our organization, I suppose, and Mark and the people that he has helped to contribute to this document. And I've helped editing it. And it's truly a wonderful piece of work that I think will help a lot of people. So that's just one resource. I know there's a couple other resources like that around too. You can find information on how to do this, but ultimately, I'd say right now, most people that are working in the space are doing the work underground. I know for a fact here in Vancouver, there's a really rich underground scene of therapists that are doing this. There's Facebook groups cropping up where therapists are talking about practices and stuff like this. There's obviously a lot of at conferences and social events. Obviously, there's not many in person right now because of COVID, but before that, there was, you know, at conferences, that's a great place for people to network and share their experiences. And so I think just networking is obviously is important, and just to learning who's in the space, and connecting with people who in your city who might be doing underground work, connecting with psychedelic societies. I know in some cities, that's actually kind of like I know across Canada, there's quite a few cities where there is no psychedelic research body. So there's not a MAPS presence necessarily in some cities. Like we only have an official presence in Toronto and Vancouver. So in other cities, the best bet is to, you know, look at your university that's nearby and see if they have a psychedelic society. And if they don't, and there's a lot of interest around, then create one. That's something I'd recommend to some people out there, especially students who are looking to find that community, because the community is super important. To have people to talk about these experiences with, whether or not you're someone that's trying to do therapy with these drugs, or if you're just someone that's had some psychedelic experiences and you want to share them with people. But I don't know, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful, because the other thing that I think about too, and you mentioned the psychedelic guides, and is like safety and insurance. How do you figure that one out?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. I think that's something that's hasn't actually been finalized yet, because I know it's one thing to have safety measures. There's obviously a bunch of safety measures and precautions that are taken in the actual studies that we've been doing. So I know for a fact, like there's simple things like you can't, you have to have the room set up in a particular way in terms of it, being like resembling like the living room. You can't have overhead lights because you don't want people looking straight at them because they're too bright. You need to have a bathroom that's private and accessible. There's little things like that that probably you would need to ensure that you'd have if you were to make sure that you're not going to be getting into any legal trouble. So there's stuff like that they're trying to establish, but nothing's firmly set yet. And so when it comes to if you're talking about underground therapists doing this work, there is, I'm sure they have, I know from firsthand experience with some of the psychologists and therapists that I've worked with and seen here in Vancouver, there are like forms that you sign and stuff like this, but I don't really know how much those would hold up in legal court, considering the fact that they're doing something illegal to begin with, right? Technically they're doing something illegal to begin with. So I can't really answer that question too well, to be honest. I'm not sure exactly, but I think when it rolls out legally, then there's obviously going to be all this a swath of protocols and stuff that would be implemented to prevent harm done to the therapist legally.
And you're saying that MDMA is looking at being legally prescribed by a doctor, psychiatrist by 2021. Is that correct?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
That's leaps and bounds, man.
Yeah, it's crazy. And that's all MAPS, basically. MAPS since 1986, that's been their main focus. That's when MAPS was founded by Rick. And Rick's the one that's had I think the most overarching vision for this, because he's, like you said, he's been in the game for a long time now, and MAPS is by a lot of people considered to be some sort of a gold standard in some ways of kind of the work that's we're trying to do here in the space. And I think that no matter what outcomes we want to get, like this seems to be the type of path that a lot of people are going to have to take. But anyways, like kudos to Rick, because and obviously Mark, that's kind of followed him in 2011 when he started MAPS Canada to help support that. But so like millions and millions of dollars have been put into to doing this. And I think maybe that's something that people don't realize, is that this has been a really lengthy, ongoing, arduous process to get it to that point. So I think that there's going to be a lot of room and need for celebration next year when that does happen, because it's been truly an amazing ride for them.
Well, and I learned a little bit about the history of this in How to Change Your Mind by Michael, what's his?
Pollan.
Yeah. Have you read that book?
I have, yeah. And actually I gave it to my mom, and it was a book that she's totally converted her. And now she's like, she wasn't like against it to begin with, but now she's just like swung the opposite way. And
yeah, you see it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an awesome book. That's cool that you read it.
And I love the history there, and how Timothy Leary, it's like, for those of you listening, is he was this sort of how would you, like, almost like a angelic, evangelic rather, sort of person in the psychedelic LSD culture. So is he a hero, or is he considered a villain nowadays in the world of psychedelics?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I honestly don't know. I know probably as much as you do about him. I think, like, I know he was a psychologist. I know he kind of started what was called, I believe, the Harvard Psychedelic Club. And he obviously, like you say, was a huge figure in the space, because he was the one that coined the term in dropout. You guys can look it up at home. Just look up Timothy Leary. He basically coined this term, and it became like a slogan for the psychedelic movement, and it actually kind of turned people off. And I think that was a big part of the reason why Nixon came in guns blazing against this thing, because it started to be, I think, to answer the question, I think Timothy Leary is seen as both a villain and a hero. Like, obviously he did a lot of work in the space. He even conducted some studies, including I think the Good Friday experiment, which was a really famous study that he did, looking at I believe it was mushroom experiences. But what he also did, unfortunately, was he made the movement seem like an antisocial movement, like that. He kind of
counterculture.
Exactly, counterculture. And what we're trying to do with MAPS, and what I hope and what I see other organizations doing that are cropping up, is we're trying to modernize this movement to show that it's actually the opposite of that. It's pro-social, and it has always been pro-social. Like as these medicines have been integrated in these cultures, it was never something that cast people outside of their culture or society. If anything, it did the opposite. It strengthened people's ties to themselves, their neighbors, their family, their cultures. And so it's always been pro-social. And I think Timothy Leary is regarded as a villain in the sense, because he kind of, whether or not he knew what he was doing or not, he accidentally or purposefully skewed that and just made the movement stray away from what it actually was.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's I'm looking at your background here right now, and it's this this temple like building of glass, and it just makes me think like the world that we live in is so inorganic. At least that the one that I live in, and looking at your background, the one that you're in, it's so inorganic, and we try to control it so much, and that's why I feel like we live in the age of anxiety and depression and all this mental illness, is because the environment that we're in is just, it's not real, right? And it sounds like at MAPS, part of it is like, we're trying to alleviate the symptoms of our own existential despair.
Yeah, I like to think about it like that a lot of the time. It does feel like that's what we're doing in a lot of ways.
So once you get this done with the 2021, what is the future for MAPS after you get the MDMA licensing for 2021? What's the future?
So there's a couple studies that we're actually working on right now, and we're actually working towards the end. So I'll speak to MAPS Canada
Sure.
in particular. So we're actually in the process right now of finishing up a fundraiser that we've been doing since last October, and we're on track our initial goal was 150K, but we got that, and so we've extended it to 250, and we're at about 236,000 right now towards that goal. And the money that we're raising right now is going towards 3 future studies that we're going to be looking at exploring. And so the first one is an eating disorder study, and so this is also using MDMA. But yeah, we're looking at, basically we funded phase 1, or we've secured funding for phase 1, but we're looking ahead now to do recruiting. And this will basically be looking at, using MDMA to help treat eating disorders, it has actually been shown in a couple areas to have a lot of benefit for that specific condition. And then another study is cognitive processing therapy for PTSD. So cognitive processing therapy itself is a type of therapy that's been around for a while, but the idea is to combine it with MDMA, and also to look at doing that not only just for individuals with PTSD, but actually bringing, as part of the same study, bringing in that person's partner. So they're like, you're basically looking at a couple, and you're treating the one individual PTSD, but like involving the partner in it as well. So it's kind of an interesting take on that, on couples therapy. So those are kind of 2 studies that are currently like funding. And then also I would mention that there has been talk that Mark Hayden and Rick Doblin have discussed potentially investing into ibogaine treatments. And so ibogaine is another psychedelic that maybe not as many people have heard of compared to other psychedelics, but it's actually ibogaine is like the naturally occurring substance, and it's found in iboga, which is an African root plant. And this is a drug that really goes deep to the core of people's illnesses, and has been shown to really help with opioid addictions. And so this really hits home for us, because here in Vancouver, this is a really big problem that we're facing. And I know it's not just here, like it's all over the world, it's a big problem, but in Vancouver, we definitely have an epicenter of that. And it hits really close to home, because when we have our general meetings, like our MAPS Canada community, we meet every month. Before COVID, we would meet, and our meeting building is right in the downtown east side, which is the epicenter of this pandemic. So it's always just an interesting contrast to be up in this building talking about psychedelic healing, and you look outside and there's literally people that need it, potentially overdosing on the streets, that really need it. So that's definitely an option that we're looking into. But yeah, those are kind of the main goals, specific projects that we're looking at doing. But I think ultimately the main goal is to legalize all psychedelics. So that's what's ahead for us.
You're preaching to the choir with me, my friend. Last question. Okay. So, I have people in my family and I love them dearly. But I describe them as, in this regard, closed-minded. So how do you convert someone with a closed mind? Like you said with your mom, you gave her this book and, you know, you won her over, but someone like your dad, how do you make people see the light?
That's a really good point. I think maybe a good place to start, like obviously is maybe recommending some videos or just information to send, but you know, oftentimes that not necessarily is going to be an easy way to do that. You know, it might take more than that. And I think ultimately what you can do, one of the best things you can do is just keep being awesome while also um, being an advocate for these things. And what I mean is like, show the world that you can do amazing things. Like, I don't know, whatever it is for you, like being an awesome musician, being a
Right.
talented athlete, like do all of these amazing things that you would do regardless, but make it aware to some people, and maybe not everyone, but the people that matter, like make them aware that you're actually using these substances in a productive way, and it's actually maybe helping you be better at these things. And so you are still becoming a productive, because I think people often think that if you do these drugs, it's going to make you a bad person and you're not going to be a productive
Right.
member of society. But if we can just, so I think without even saying things, like just by your actions, just by being that productive member of society, and maybe even using psychedelics to help make you a better version of yourself, I think I like to hope that it would just naturally, people will start to understand, and it's going to happen like with everyone, right? Like it's not just going to be you converting your mom or you converting your dad. It's going to be them hearing about it from their friend's son, or like their friend saying that their son also mentioned it. Like it's going
Right.
to be a flow effect and everyone's involved, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I would
Let's
say.
let's have an open dialogue versus a closed dialogue, right?
Totally, and that's so important too. And yeah, just not. I think a lot of people also maybe are scared to bring it up with their parents. I know sometimes it's can be really hard for people. I was really lucky because, you know, although I said my dad's maybe not as into it as my mom, and maybe my mom took a little bit of convincing. Like that's coming from the point of like but I think their base was still like +10 or something. Like they were just super open to it, and I'm lucky that they were. But I know for some people, like, you know, someone might be disavowed by their parents if they told them that, or depending on what culture you're in, right? So you do have to be
Right.
careful. But I think doing your best you can to really be open with your parents about this, and just and show them the benefits and just the truth around these things, I think goes a long way.
Awesome. Well, you know, and kind of just a closing little remark here, but how will this look like for the world of sports? Because there was this pitcher in the MLB and he pitched a perfect game on LSD, which I'm
What?
like, what? Yeah, yeah. To me, that sounds like a
No way.
hindrance, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not a performance enhancer. That's a performance dehancer. Anyways, you know, it makes me think like, what will that
Yeah.
look like for professional athletes?
Yeah, I
Um,
wonder. I've heard of people microdosing and even doing small doses of
right.
mushrooms, like for sports like skiing. I've heard it's helped a lot of people be better at skiing, and also cannabis too. But yeah, I wonder what that would look like.
So much around the psychedelic drugs is the from what I hear is diminishment of the ego, right? It
Mm.
shrinks your ego down, right? So which
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
is something that everybody in this world can benefit from,
Yeah, I think so.
right?
Yeah.
So Michael, you're doing wonderful work. Thank you so much for your time. For those listeners, how can they check out more about the work that you are doing at MAPS?
So yeah, the best thing to do is just for Maps Canada, just go to mapscanada.org, and you can find out pretty much all of our information there. There's links to our fundraiser campaign, which, like I mentioned, we're currently on right now and looking to move into the final stretch. There's information there on our current studies, our past studies. There's information also if you're in the Vancouver area or Toronto area. We have lots of volunteer opportunities, and so that's actually most of my job is coordinating volunteers. So my email's there, and you can reach out to me personally. I love to chat with you about that. And yeah, any other questions people have, they can find my email, and even Mark's contact on the website too.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. This was awesome.
All righty.